Dawn, June 22, 1941. We are at the Wolfschanze headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, in Rastenburg, East Prussia. The clock reads 3:14 a.m. The air is thick. This is not a quiet night. This is the suffocating stillness just before the greatest storm in human history. Inside a reinforced concrete bunker, Adolf Hitler stands alone in the sparsely lit study, staring at a massive map. He wears a gray field uniform, devoid of rank. Far from the image of a hysterical dictator, tonight he is unusually calm, almost serene. His eyes burn with an absolute conviction. At exactly 3:15 a.m., hundreds of miles to the east, an order is given. Not with words, but with a storm of steel. Thousands of artillery pieces open fire in unison, ripping the night apart. Columns of panzer tanks roar and crush the border fences. In the sky, thousands of warplanes take off, their engines creating a symphony of destruction. This is Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion force ever assembled. 3,600,000 Axis soldiers, 3,600 tanks, over 2,700 warplanes, a front stretching 2,900 kilometers, from the ice of the Baltic to the heat of the Black Sea. All of them, at this moment, are hurtling toward the Soviet Union. Back at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler remains standing. He doesn't need to hear the reports. He already knows the outcome. For him, this is not a war. This is a judgment. Weeks earlier, in the final planning meetings with the High Command, every concern about Russia's scale, about the Red Army's potential, had been dismissed. The generals, fresh from conquering Western Europe in weeks, were still wary of the Eastern monster. But Hitler had silenced all doubt with a single sentence. A sentence that perfectly encapsulated the confidence that would become a catastrophe. In a smoke-filled briefing room, he had slammed his hand on the table and declared, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will collapse." This was not a mere military metaphor. This was a declaration of faith. To understand the coming catastrophe, we must dissect this sentence. What was the rotten structure? In Hitler's mind, the Soviet Union was not a nation. It was an ideological and racial abomination. It was Jewish Bolshevism, an entity, according to Nazi doctrine, run by Jewish conspirators and populated by millions of Untermenschen, Slavic subhumans. Hitler's confidence did not just come from military success. It was built on a bedrock of absolute contempt. He believed that his superior Aryan warriors, tempered in the lightning victories in France and Poland, would simply sweep aside these Asiatic hordes. Furthermore, he knew what Stalin had done to his own army. The Great Purge of 1937 had decapitated the Red Army, executing or imprisoning its finest military minds, like Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. German intelligence reported that the Red Army was a headless giant, short on officers, poorly equipped and paralyzed by fear of its own regime. And to kick in the door, that was the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. The German war machine seemed unstoppable. They had crushed Poland in 4 weeks, Denmark and Norway in days, the Netherlands, Belgium, and most importantly, France, supposedly the strongest military power in Europe, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. Why would Russia be any different? For Hitler, Operation Barbarossa was not a conventional war. It was a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. No rules, no prisoners, only extermination. The goal was not occupation, but erasure. To create Lebensraum, living space, for the German race. And he had promised his generals, promised the German people that this crusade would be over quickly. Goebbels' propaganda machine was ready. Victory was predicted by October, November at the latest. Certainly, everything would be over before the brutal Russian winter could set in. The soldiers sent to the front were issued only summer uniforms. No one bothered to prepare winter coats, antifreeze lubricants, or lined boots. Why prepare for a winter you do not intend to stay for? Hitler's confidence was bolstered by the strange silence from the other side. For months, British intelligence and even his own spy, Richard Sorge in Tokyo, had warned Stalin of the impending invasion. But Stalin refused to believe it. Stalin was blindly faithful to his non-aggression pact with Hitler. He had been supplying the Nazis with oil, grain, and rubber, fueling the very war machine about to crush him. When reports of German troops massing on the border flew to Moscow, Stalin dismissed them as British provocations, or ordered the messengers shot. On this very night of June 22nd, Red Army units on the border were fast asleep. Many units were not even allowed to carry ammunition for fear of provoking the Germans. Back in the wolf's lair, Hitler turned away from the map. He looked out the bunker window, but saw only the darkness of the forest. This was the zenith of confidence, a moment in history when one man, driven by ideology, racial contempt, and an impossible string of victories, believed himself to be the embodiment of destiny. He did not see a nation of 17 million square kilometers. He did not see 190 million people, many of whom would rather die than surrender. He did not see the winters that could freeze engines and break wills. He saw only a rotten wooden door, waiting for his fateful kick. The door was kicked in, and in the first weeks of the summer of 1941, the entire structure did indeed seem to be collapsing, exactly as Hitler had predicted. The plan, on paper, was a masterpiece of brutal ambition. It had a clear, almost biblical objective in its scale, the AA line, an imaginary line running from the port of Arkhangelsk on the White Sea, through Gorky, down the Volga River, to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. Everything west of that line, all of European Russia, would be conquered, pacified, enslaved. Any remnants of the Red Army pushed east of that line would be bombed into the Stone Age by the Luftwaffe. This was not a plan of occupation. This was a plan of erasure. The immediate military goal, outlined in Führer Directive 21, was even clearer. Destroy the bulk of the Red Army forces concentrated west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers. They must be prevented at all costs from retreating into the endless Russian interior. This was the key. The war had to be decided right at the border. Giant panzer spearheads would thrust deep, converging behind the Soviet armies, creating massive Kesselschlachten, cauldron battles, to trap and annihilate hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers at a time. Why did they believe so absolutely in such a fantastical plan? The first and most obvious reason was the arrogance of success. They were the masters of the blitzkrieg, the lightning war. The German war machine was a perfectly tuned instrument, and it had just played its greatest symphony in France. The French army, considered the most powerful land force in Europe, protected by the impenetrable Maginot Line, had disintegrated and surrendered in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The German High Command, OKW, looked at the Soviet Union and saw a far inferior opponent. This contempt was fed by the second, and perhaps most dangerous layer of confidence, ideology. For the Nazis, this was not a war between two nations. This was a conflict between two worlds, the world of the superior Aryan and the world of the WWII. Slavic Untermenschen, subhumans ruled by a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. This belief was not just propaganda, it was the core of their military doctrine. They truly believed the Slavic soldier was fundamentally stupid, passive, and fought only under the threat of a commissar's machine gun at his back. They believed that once the thin veneer of communist control was broken, millions of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Balts would welcome the German troops as liberators. This ideological blindness led them to catastrophic miscalculations. They looked at Soviet industrial capacity and dismissed it. They cannot produce quality tanks, German analysts reported. Their economy is chaotic and inefficient. They completely ignored the possibility of relocating entire industries east of the Ural Mountains, the greatest industrial migration in history. And then there was the third, seemingly rational reason, Stalin's Great Purge. German intelligence had watched with almost disbelieving glee as Stalin, in a fit of paranoia in 1937, decapitated his own military, 3 of his 5 marshals, 13 of his 15 army commanders, 8 of his 9 admirals, tens of thousands of lower-ranking officers, All were shot or sent to the gulags. The most innovative minds, like Tukhachevsky, who had pioneered deep battle doctrines, ironically, more advanced than blitzkrieg, were replaced by politically loyal but militarily inept hacks like Voroshilov and Budyani. The German army, perhaps the most professional force in the world, was preparing to face an army that had been crippled by its own leader. They were not wrong on this point. They were only wrong about the resilience of the beast they were about to provoke. Finally, there was an economic imperative. Hitler could not win a long war with the British Empire, and eventually the United States, without the resources of the Soviet Union. He needed the oil of the Caucasus to fuel his tanks and planes. He needed the wheat of the Ukraine to feed his people. He needed the coal and minerals of the Donbass basin. Barbarossa was not just an option, it was seen as an economic necessity, and it had to be done quickly. And so, the plan was launched. The initial promises were not just met, they were spectacularly exceeded. The first victory reports in the first 48 hours were almost unbelievable. The first news came from the Luftwaffe. Thousands of Soviet pilots were caught completely by surprise. Their aircraft, painted in bright green, were lined up neatly on airfields, perfect targets for the Stuka and Messerschmitt pilots. By the end of June 23rd, over 2,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them before they ever left the ground. The Red Air Force was wiped from the western skies in hours. The skies belonged to the Germans. On the ground, the Panzer spearheads moved at dizzying speed. In the north, Army Group North drove for Leningrad. In the south, Army Group South aimed for Kiev and the Ukrainian breadbasket. But the real jewel was in the center. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock unleashed two massive panzer pincers, commanded by the tank geniuses Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth. They sliced through the thin Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. Red Army units at the border, forbidden from firing back for fear of provocation, were annihilated in their bunkers. Chaos reigned. Contradictory orders flew from Moscow, where Stalin, in a state of nervous collapse, had locked himself in his dacha for days. Just 6 days after the invasion, on June 28th, Guderian's and Hoth's pincers closed east of Minsk. Trapped inside was the entire Soviet Western Front. The Battle of Białystok-Minsk was a victory on a scale the world had never seen. When the fighting died down, over 300,000 Red Army soldiers were captured. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces were seized. In Berlin, the atmosphere was festive. Joseph Goebbels, in a famous press conference, told foreign journalists the war was essentially won. He promised the German public that the final collapse was a matter of weeks. Even the most cautious generals in the Army High Command, OKH, were swept up in the euphoria. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, who initially had his doubts, wrote in his diary in early July, "It is not an overstatement to say that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. The victory bulletins kept pouring in. Army Group Center pushed on toward the next door, Smolensk. It seemed nothing on earth could stop them. They had promised the Führer and the German people a quick victory, and they were delivering it with astonishing speed. Hitler's confidence seemed utterly vindicated. The rotten structure was collapsing before their very eyes. Everything was going exactly according to plan. But there is always a but in grand plans built on hubris. The turning point was not a defeat. Ironically, it was another stunning victory. The Battle of Smolensk, which began on July 10, 1941. Smolensk, an ancient city, was called the key to Moscow. Here, Army Group Center once again swung its devastating hammer. The panzer pincers closed again, creating another massive encirclement. When the battle ended in early August, another 300,000 Red Army soldiers were captured, and thousands more tanks and guns were destroyed or seized. On the map, it was another brilliant red arrow thrusting deep into the heart of Russia. But for the sharpest commanders on the ground, Smolensk was a victory with an alarming aftertaste. The first crack was not a shock, but a weariness. For the first time, the Red Army's resistance was no longer chaotic. They began to fight with organization. And more importantly, they did not surrender. Unlike in France, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers laid down their arms when encircled, the Russians fought. Even when trapped in pockets with no supplies, no communication, no hope, they fought. They fought to the last man, the last bullet. They threw themselves at German tanks with grenades in their hands. This fanatic, almost brutal resistance began to unnerve even the most veteran German soldiers. And it was costly. It bled them of men, tanks, and ammunition. The finely tuned blitzkrieg machine designed for high-speed dashes was being forced for the first time to stop and engage in a bloody war of attrition. And then the second crack appeared, much larger. It came not from the battlefield, but from intelligence reports. Let us shift the scene from the dusty, bloody front to the headquarters of the Army High Command, OKH, in East Prussia. This was the brain of the war, and the key man here was not a screaming warrior, but a meticulous organizer, almost an accountant of war. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff. Halder was the man who had recorded in his diary the initial euphoria that the war was won in 14 days. Let us now read his diary from early August, as the Battle of Smolensk was raging. The tone has completely changed. The confidence is gone, replaced by a quiet, mathematical horror. On August 11, 1941, Halder wrote, "It becomes clearer and clearer that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. We calculated, before the campaign, they had about 200 divisions. We have now already counted 360. With every dozen divisions we destroy, the Russians throw in another dozen." This was it. This was the moment the rotten structure was supposed to have collapsed, but somehow it kept throwing new armies out of thin air. Hitler and the High Command had kicked in the door, but instead of an empty room, they found themselves facing an endless hallway, and from every new door, a new enemy rushed out. They had underestimated not just the Russian spirit, but their sheer population and industrial capacity. They had no idea that the Soviet Union, even as it fought, was beginning a great industrial migration, moving entire tank and aircraft factories from the Ukraine and Western Russia to safety behind the Ural Mountains. They were fighting an enemy that could regenerate, and it was at this critical moment, as the alarming truth of the Soviet Union's endless reserves began to sink in, that the third, fatal crack appeared, right inside the German High Command itself. It was Adolf Hitler's indecision. After the victory at Smolensk, Moscow was only 350 kilometers away. The road was nearly open. The generals of Army Group Center, von Bock, Guderian, Hoth, all pleaded. "Führer," they said, "let us continue. Strike the decisive blow. Take Moscow. It is the political heart, the command center, the railway hub. Take Moscow and the Soviet Union will collapse." It was pure military logic. But Hitler, the man of absolute confidence in June, now wavered. For the first time, he was unsure. Ideology and economic goals began to conflict with military logic. He looked north toward Leningrad, the cradle of Bolshevism, a symbolic prize. He looked south toward the Ukraine, the vast breadbasket, and more importantly, toward the Caucasus, where the oil he craved was located. He feared that if Army Group Center advanced too quickly, its flanks would be exposed. He was obsessed with capturing resources before winter. On August 21, 1941, Hitler issued Directive 34, one of the most disastrous decisions of the entire war. He overruled his generals. He ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance on Moscow. Instead, he ordered his strongest armor, Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group, the very spearhead of the Moscow assault, to turn 90 degrees south, to participate in a massive encirclement battle around Kiev. His generals were horrified. Guderian flew to the Wolf's Lair to protest directly to Hitler, an act of near insubordination. He argued they were wasting precious time. The summer was ending. Every day counted. But Hitler would not listen. "My generals," Hitler later scoffed, "know nothing of the economic aspects of war." Hitler's decision wasted 5 golden weeks. 5 weeks of the dry late summer. The kick in the door had been stopped, not by the Red Army, but by the very man who had ordered the kick. Hitler's decision to turn south at first seemed to be yet another proof of his genius. It led to the greatest tactical victory in the history of warfare. The Battle of Kiev, which concluded at the end of September, was an unimaginable catastrophe for the Soviet Union. The German panzer pincers closed perfectly, creating a massive pocket. Stalin, in his typical paranoia, had forbidden his generals from retreating, calling anyone who mentioned it a coward. The result was a slaughter. When the battle was over, the Wehrmacht had captured over 660,000 prisoners. An entire Soviet southwestern front had been erased from the map. For Hitler, this was the ultimate validation. He had been right. His generals had been wrong. His confidence, which had wavered for a moment in August, now returned, stronger and more arrogant than ever. He had secured his southern flank, captured the Ukrainian breadbasket, and annihilated another 500,000 enemy troops. Now, he turned his attention back to the ultimate prize, Moscow. On September 30th, 1941, he launched Operation Typhoon. The name said it all, a final furious storm that would wipe out the Soviet capital and end the war before winter. In a few weeks, he boasted in a proud speech to his soldiers, "We will be in Moscow. This will be the final, decisive blow of the war." The hubris had reached its peak. Everything left in Army Group Center, nearly 2 million soldiers, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, was thrown into this attack. And again, the initial successes were spectacular. The Germans broke through the new Soviet defense lines. They created 2 more giant encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing another 600,000 prisoners. The numbers were staggering. In 4 months, the Germans had captured nearly 3 million Soviet soldiers. How could any nation sustain such losses and keep fighting? But as they did, a new enemy appeared. An enemy Hitler, in his arrogance, had completely ignored. This enemy carried no guns or tanks. The Russians call it Rasputitsa, the mud season. In mid-October, the autumn rains began, and they did not stop. The entire Russian West, which had very few paved roads, turned into a sea of thick, waist-deep mud. The blitzkrieg stopped. Dead. The panzer tanks, the great weapons of conquest, were rendered useless. They were bogged down in the mire, their engines roaring helplessly. The supply trucks, the army's lifeblood, were stuck hundreds of miles behind. Horses, the primary movers for the German infantry, died by the thousands from exhaustion, drowning in the mud. The German soldiers, now fighting the mud as much as the Russians, had to carry every shell, every can of food, by hand for miles through the cold, life-sucking ooze. An entire, mighty invasion force had been brought to a halt by the weather. Then, in early November, the mud froze. At first, there was a sigh of relief. Finally, the ground was hard. The tanks could move. The offensive resumed. And then, General Winter truly arrived. The temperature dropped. First to 10 degrees C, then 20 degrees C, then 30 degrees C. By early December, it hit 40 degrees C. This was the price of hubris. The Germans were completely unprepared. They were still wearing the summer uniforms they had worn when they crossed the border in June. They had no winter coats, no gloves, no lined boots. They had no anti-freeze lubricant for their weapons or engines. The disaster was corporeal. Machine guns jammed as their lubricant froze. Artillery pieces wouldn't fire as their breech mechanisms froze solid. Tank engines couldn't start without fires being lit beneath them for hours. Soldiers got frostbite just from touching the steel of their gun barrels. Tens of thousands suffered from frostbite. Wounds wouldn't heal. Men simply lay down in their foxholes and froze to death. An estimated 130,000 cold weather casualties were suffered that winter alone. And yet Hitler, sitting in his warm wolf's lair, kept screaming, "Forward!" By a final, superhuman effort of will, in early December, some forward panzer reconnaissance units reached the suburbs of Moscow. They were close enough to see, through binoculars in the blizzard, the golden spires of the Kremlin. They were only 20 kilometers from their goal, and they could not move another step. They were exhausted. They were frozen. They were out of fuel. They were out of ammunition. The final kick had failed, right at the doorstep, and that is when the door was kicked back. On December 5, 1941, as the Germans were at their absolute weakest, General Georgy Zhukov of the Red Army unleashed his counter-offensive. Stalin, unlike Hitler, had been listening to his intelligence. His spy, Richard Sorge in Tokyo, had confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. This allowed Stalin to do what Hitler thought was impossible. He transferred dozens of fresh, elite winter-equipped Siberian divisions from Manchuria straight to Moscow. These were soldiers the Germans had never seen. They wore white fur-lined coats and traveled on skis. They had T-34 tanks, whose diesel engines still worked in the cold, and whose wide tracks allowed them to glide over the snow. They hit the frozen Germans with the fury of a blizzard. For the first time in the war, panic spread through the Wehrmacht. The German line shattered. The soldiers who had conquered Europe now turned and fled west, dropping their weapons, their vehicles, anything that would slow them down. This was not a tactical withdrawal. This was a rout. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler fell into a rage. He could not believe it. He refused to accept reality, and so he began to assign blame. First, he blamed the weather. "It's an unusual winter," he roared, even though meteorologists had warned him this was a perfectly normal Russian winter. Next, and more importantly, he blamed his generals. When veteran commanders like Fedor von Bock and Heinz Guderian called, begging for permission to make tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions, Hitler screamed into the phone, calling them cowards, failures, and traitors. Hitler's desperation turned into a purge. He fired dozens of generals. Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, was fired on the spot. Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, was relieved of command. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, was dismissed in disgrace. And then, in the final escalation of hubris, Hitler did the unthinkable. He announced that he, Adolf Hitler, would personally assume the role of commander-in-chief of the army. "Any idiot can direct operations," he declared. "The high command is just a bunch of conservative cowards." The confidence of June had become the desperate paranoia of December. The plan for a 3-month campaign had failed. The Blitzkrieg was dead in the snow, and the war of attrition, the war Germany could never win, had now officially begun. The panicked flight from Moscow threatened to turn into a catastrophe even greater than Napoleon's retreat. Soldiers abandoned their weapons, divisions disintegrated. A total collapse of Army Group Center seemed imminent, and it was here that Hitler, in his rage and desperation, issued one of the most controversial orders of the war, the Haltebefehl, the hold order. He, as the new commander-in-chief of the army, forbade all retreat. He screamed over the phone at his generals, ordering every unit, every division, every soldier to hedgehog, sich einigeln, to dig in, cling to the frozen ground, and fight to the last man. Anyone who fell back one step without an explicit order would be shot. Tactically, this was madness. It sacrificed tens of thousands of lives uselessly, as they froze to death in indefensible positions. But on a brutal strategic level, this iron order, ironically, may have saved the Wehrmacht from total annihilation. It stopped the panic. It forced the army to form a front, however thin and broken, instead of dissolving into a running mob. But more importantly, psychologically, the hold order was the first undeniable, implicit admission that the plan had failed. This was the moment the Blitzkrieg, the war of rapid mobile maneuver, officially died. The war was no longer about panzer spearheads racing forward. It had become a Stellungskrieg, a positional war, a war of shovels and brutal endurance. The plan to kick in the door and end the war in 3 months was gone. The only goal now was to survive the winter. When spring 1942 arrived and the snows began to melt, the Nazi propaganda machine began one of the most spectacular moving of the goalposts in history. No one, ever, in the high command or on Berlin radio, uttered the word failure. They did not say, "We failed to take Moscow." They said, "We destroyed the last Bolshevik reserves before the gates of their capital." They did not say, "Our war machine froze and was stopped." They said, "We bravely weathered a freak God-given winter." A test no army in history could have endured. They didn't admit Barbarossa was dead. Instead, they simply rebranded it. What was the original plan? To defeat the Soviet Union in one summer campaign. That objective had clearly failed. So what was the new objective? If you can't achieve your old goal, create a new one and declare it was the plan all along. Hitler and the High Command began preparing for the 1942 summer campaign. But this time, the objective had subtly but profoundly changed. The goal was no longer Moscow. Goebbels' propaganda machine began to speak less of the Bolshevik capital, the political heart of Russia, and more about something else, something in the south. The new plan, codenamed Fallblau, Case Blue, was the final implicit admission. It was no longer an attempt to destroy the entire rotten structure in one blow. Instead, it was an attempt to seize its economic resources. The new objective, the oil fields of the Caucasus, Grozny, Baku. This moving of the goalposts said it all. It was an admission that Germany could not win a lightning war, and was now stuck in a long, total war. And to sustain that war, they needed fuel. The war was no longer called a quick campaign for Lebensraum. It was reframed. It was now a great crusade. It was a war of Europe led by Germany against the Asiatic hordes. It was a struggle for survival, not to conquer, but to defend Western civilization from Bolshevik barbarism. This change in language was how they rationalized failure. They hadn't failed to conquer Russia in 3 months. They had succeeded in holding the enemy while preparing for the next phase of a world historic struggle. In this way, Hitler and his generals could look at the maps, which showed the vast territories they had conquered, the Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and claim a partial victory. They had achieved great things, destroyed millions of enemy soldiers, and survived the winter. They did not admit that the very act of surviving was proof that the original plan, the kick in the door, had been a catastrophic miscalculation of the grandest scale. In 1945, as the Third Reich burned, the question was asked, where did it all go wrong? The answer, written not in ink but in the blood of millions, always came back to the winter of 1941. The post-mortem is clear. Operation Barbarossa failed. It wasn't just a failure to take Moscow. It was a foundational failure, a complete collapse of Germany's entire war strategy. The kick in the door had failed to collapse the rotten structure. Instead, it had shattered the attacker's ankle. The core and most tragic lesson is the mortal danger of ideology. Hitler and the German High Command did not lose because of a military miscalculation. They lost because they believed their own myths. They believed the Slavs were Untermenschen, that one Aryan warrior was worth 10 Bolshevik soldiers. They believed in the rottenness of the communist system so completely that they ignored the incredible resilience and brutal patriotism of the Russian people. General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of the Fourth Army, summarized it perfectly after the war. He wrote, "The politicians, meaning Hitler, had underestimated Russia's strength like the rest of the world. They based their judgments on what they saw on the surface. But underneath was a gigantic, resilient strength they could not comprehend. This ideological blindness led to the second lesson. Logistics is fate. Hitler's iron will, his hold-at-all-costs order, could temporarily stop a panic, but it could not conjure fuel from snow or turn water into antifreeze. The Germans were defeated not just by the Red Army, but by the two fundamental truths of Russia, space and weather. The Blitzkrieg was designed for the paved roads of France and the small countryside of Poland. It was never designed to conquer a continent. The sheer vastness of Russia swallowed it. Its supply lines were stretched to the breaking point hundreds of miles before the first soldier ever saw Moscow. It was Heinz Guderian, the architect of the victory in France, who admitted this bitterly in a desperate letter home in November 1941, even before the counterattack began. He wrote, "We have gravely underestimated the Russians, the country, and the climate. This is the revenge of reality." And finally, the third lesson was on the limits of lightning war. Blitzkrieg works when it can destroy the enemy's brain, its command center, its capital, in a single blow. It worked in Paris, but in Russia, the Red Army had what the French did not: endless space to retreat. They traded land for time. And with that time, they moved their factories, mobilized their endless reserves, and waited. The historical consequence of this failure is absolute. It sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The failure of Barbarossa turned Hitler's greatest fear into reality, a two-front war. It turned the Wehrmacht from an invincible, conquering machine into a desperate fire brigade, racing back and forth across a vast front, being bled to death in the war of attrition they could never win. 90% of all German military casualties in World War II would occur on the Eastern Front. The door Hitler so confidently kicked in that June did not in the end collapse. It slammed shut, and it crushed Army Group Center, the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, and eventually the entire mad dream of a 1,000-year Reich, of the more than 3 million soldiers who crossed the border on that bright summer night. Believing they would be home by Christmas, the vast majority would never see Germany again. They remain forever in the frozen soil, silent monuments to the catastrophe born from a single, arrogant sentence.